be the therapeutic agent in the event of a traumatic brain injury?
I actually started my undergraduate career interested in science. I thought that I would, as many people who are interested in science, I'd go to college, I'll be a biology major, I'll go to medical school. And so I went off to my first biology class at the University of Virginia, all excited, and I hated it. I really had to do some soul searching about what it was I was interested in. So I was taking this one class. It was a introductory neuroscience class, kind of the equivalent here at FSU would be the brain and behavior class. And I found that I could actually be, or at that stage, create a neuroscience major. So traumatic brain injury is a spectrum of disorders. So it might be an injury that is very, very mild, a single hit to the head, say in an older person who falls, or an athlete whose head hits the ground, or another player. It could be a more moderate type of brain injury, car accident, head hitting the windshield or the steering wheel. And it could be a very severe, what we call open head injury, where bone actually breaks and there's penetration of an object, say combat wounds are often open head injuries. And so there's a wide spectrum, of course, of symptoms from mild to severe that would be with any kind of traumatic brain injury. Depression, anxiety, aggression, fogginess, headaches, nausea, and all of these are worse up to even coma in a very severe kind of traumatic brain injury. Let's say a person falls. Let's say we have a person who the back of their head hits the ground. What happens is the back of the head gets injured, of course, but that's not the end of the injury. That brain, which is basically floating in fluid, which we call cerebral spinal fluid, when the head hits the back, it bounces forward and can even bounce several times. So you'll have injury, what we call coup contra coup injury, injury on opposite sides of the head. Same thing if you hit on the side, then that brain is going to bounce back and forth. And so that can cause swelling. It can cause blood vessels to rupture, and there can actually be bleeds, and it can cause death of cells in either of the areas that get injured. And then clearly if something penetrates the brain, we have a focal injury where the penetration occurs. And then here's the scary part. The injury doesn't stop at the moment of the impact. The injury spreads with time. I think what's more recently been recognized is the impact of milder brain injuries, the impact of what we call concussion, that someone might not even lose consciousness, but their brain can still be affected. I think that's the thing that we're recognizing more and more in recently. The other thing that has gotten, I think, much more attention, appropriately so, is the impact of repetitive concussion. So one mild concussion, you might be able to heal from that and be fine. But if you take a second one, particularly a second one within a couple of weeks of the first, then it's not just additive injury, it's actually synergistic, where both of them together are worse than either one of the initial injuries. And so that's a very new concept that I think we're only now appreciating. So if the patient doesn't recognize the symptoms, it will go unreported. But unfortunately, even sometimes when patients do recognize the symptoms of mild brain injury or concussion, fogginess, maybe a little bit of confusion, maybe some visual problems, more headaches than usual, depression is definitely one that is very common in milder forms of head injury. Often, patients don't report those either. And this is a big problem, particularly in sports. Athletes don't want to be pulled from play, so they don't report it. Or they play down the symptoms, and then occasionally you've got the coach that says, shake it off, because you just got your bell rung, right? Getting your bell rung, so to speak, is often a concussion. And even if it's not, doesn't rise to the level of concussion, I worry about the next time it happens and the next time it happens and what the cumulative effect of those things are. So I really do worry about underreporting and, well, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. Well, pulling them from play is what we absolutely must be doing about it. And so the awareness of what these symptoms are, even when they seem mild, is very, very important. Severe traumatic brain injury is very, very hard to treat. Severe traumatic brain injury, people can be in comas for the rest of their life, right? Severe traumatic brain injury can have severe motor disturbances, so where people are wheelchair or bound or bedridden. Depression is a major problem in actually all forms of traumatic brain injury, from mild to severe. Depression is the single most common poor outcome of all forms of traumatic brain injury. And then there are 100,000 people a year that die from traumatic brain injury. So it's a real problem. 1.5 million people every year sustain some form of traumatic brain injury. So it's a big problem. So the data tell us that young men are more susceptible to head injury than young women, and there's probably a lot of sociological factors associated with that. The age group of 17 to early 20s or 19 to mid 20s is the age group that is very susceptible to head injuries. A lot of those being car accidents, right? About the age when people start getting a driver's license. The participation in the activities in foreign countries and wars, certainly associated with one estimate is that 20% of the troops coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq have suffered some kind of traumatic brain injury. And then the next big group are people over 65. And that's falls primarily. So balance and keeping balance and keeping muscles strong and bones strong as we age is actually one really good way to prevent traumatic brain injuries in older populations. There's really not a mechanism, because one of the things is we don't have a really good idea of what to look for. If you do a brain scan of a person with a mild concussion, honestly, you don't really see anything. We're just now getting to the era of technology where we have functional measures, so we call functional MRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, that can show the activity of the brain in different regions, and we think that that's going to help us identify milder forms of brain injury. But right now, a lot of the standard clinical measures, you don't really see it. It's people say, I don't feel right, I feel foggy, I can't concentrate, I'm having trouble sleeping at night, my appetite, these sort of very non-specific symptoms that can all be tied back to their head injury, but when we look for what actually happened in the brain, we don't really see anything. So there really isn't a reason to routinely check people, even these at-risk populations like football players. I mean, there's a social pressure to play football. It's an exciting game, right? I mean, not just because of the sort of violence involved in it, but just because of the strategy that's involved and the great deal of intelligence it takes to remember all of those plays and who's doing what with all the. I mean, it's an exciting, intelligent game. It's also a very dangerous game. And it's not just football, right? Any contact sport is going to have risks. Cheering. One of the areas where we see a non-contact sport where there's a lot of head injuries is cheerleading, because of cheerleaders, both men and women, falling or being dropped accidentally and hitting their head on the ground. Patients can recover if their injury is relatively mild. Severe injury, there will be lifelong impairments. There's just not really any way to completely heal a severe injury. But mild concussions, particularly if there's rest and good support for any problems that they're having as far as like depression and anxiety and other stressors, people can recover. But it's very important not to then go get another concussion And so, because once you've had one, the data say very clearly you're much more likely to sustain an additional one, and then that's where the problem comes from. Unfortunately, right now there really aren't pharmacological interventions for particularly our mild or repetitive concussion. It's really pull from play, it's rest, it's pain medication, anti-inflammatories, things, but there aren't really any drugs that we give that are just for traumatic brain injury.
Gotcha.
It's drugs that are used really for other things that would be for almost any type of injury. And that's an area of research, understanding what goes wrong in the brain and are there specific things we can do after injury to reduce that spreading damage.
Right.
A mild traumatic brain injury probably costs close to $100,000 to treat, because we talk about counseling for depression, missed work time or school time, and anti-inflammatory drugs, pain drugs. So the estimates have been around $80,000 when one even gets a mild traumatic brain injury. A moderate traumatic brain injury, where there's actual impairment, maybe hospitalization, the estimates are around $1 million. And a severe traumatic brain injury, where there's rehabilitation and maybe even long-term care involved, and so the cost of care of daily caregiving is about $3 million. If you multiply that times the 1.5 million Americans that will get a head injury just this year, we see that it's a phenomenal cost. And so this is why I really stress prevention, because once the injury has occurred, it becomes your life. It takes over your life, not just financially, but also socially, and it affects relationships across the board. And so the costs aren't just monetary, the costs are also in quality of life. Number one, really making sure that people always wear seatbelts, not having kids in contact sports too early, because the earlier you start, the more cumulative effects you have of concussions, and also the developing brain is just going to be more susceptible to injury. Balance work and exercise for older people, because falls are such a problem. I also think that in situations of conflict, of wars, we've had and certainly in our recent memory, soldiers going to war with inadequate body armor and Humvees inadequately armored, and that's just wrong. Because when inevitably something happens, they are less protected, and so making the commitment to protect the men and women who are fighting to protect us, I think is a prevention method as well. Traffic laws and speed make a difference. We know that car accidents go up if we raise the speed limit, and so when speed limits go from 70 to 80, as they are often lobbied to try to do, we have more car accidents. We are really interested in the possible use of adult stem cells to treat traumatic brain injury. And these are stem cells that we get from the bone marrow of healthy donors. Our donor is female. We think she lives in Texas from the paperwork we've seen, but she's anonymous. And we get these stem cells from her. A small vial of them come in the mail on dry ice, and then we grow them. And we use them in a preclinical model, an animal model of traumatic brain injury. And we are finding two things that we're following up on because we feel they're very important. One is the treatment of traumatic brain injury with these stem cells. And we're just infusing them into the blood, and they go to the brain. They won't go to the brain if there's no injury, but if there's an injury, these stem cells will go into the brain, and they will go to the area of injury, and they will eliminate the symptoms of depression associated with traumatic brain injury. And we're very excited about this because depression is just so hard to treat in patients with traumatic brain injury. I mean, we give the usual antidepressant drugs, but it's because it's the only game in town. It's not because it works. and the data show very clearly that traumatic brain injury associated depression is different from other kinds of depression and does not respond to the drugs. And so we think, particularly for more severe kinds of traumatic brain injury, this type of treatment could be very helpful. The second thing we found is that these stem cells may prevent other neurodegenerative disorders. So we know that when someone gets a head injury, particularly repetitive head injuries, they're at much greater risk for Parkinson's disease and much greater risk for dementia. And so from a genomic standpoint, we found that these stem cells will actually prohibit and prevent the changes associated with Parkinson's disease after traumatic brain injury. So we're in the process of following up that, and could stem cells prevent Parkinson's disease in people who've had traumatic brain injury.